Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here in the Poletaev Institute, which is a fascinating place. And today I'm going to talk about inequality, which is not very typical for this intellectual milieu. But I think the tendencies in theory I'm going to talk about, I think, going to change this situation probably, because they are powerful, bringing culture and theory into the studies of inequality right now. I think this is the very important process which will make inequality not only a very important social problem, but also very interesting issue for theory and for cultural sociology. So I'd like to start from this, giving such a bird view on the problem, and to mention two major theoretical events divided by many decades, which set the landscape for the issues I'm going to talk about. And the first event is the rise and fall of culture of poverty concept, which happened in the 60s. So this concept was coined by Oscar Lewis and some other scholars, and in the beginning it became very powerful, but then it faced very strong criticism, and not only based on empirical grounds, but also based on ethical grounds, and it probably even more powerful on ethical grounds, because it was labeled as blaming the victim, because the idea under the main idea under the culture of poverty concept was that disadvantaged are disadvantaged because of they have wrong values or wrong attitudes, and if they would change that, they would probably make a upward mobility and things like that. And because of this ethical criticism of this position, actually culture and cultural theory was actually squeezed out of the inequality studies. And even now, even till today, bringing culture into the studies of inequality brings this risk of face this ethical criticism of blaming the victim. And the second important event is the cultural turn, the cognitive turn, which is happening in social sciences in general, but in sociology in particular. I think this is one of the most important events in sociological theory right now. And what is happening on the one hand, so what is why it is happening? Well, as Paul DiMaggio mentioned a couple of decades ago, when sociologists speak about social interactions, they inevitably bring implicitly or explicitly, they bring some conceptions or ideas how human cognition operates. And if it happens implicitly, then the chances are these presuppositions are naive or based on very ancient, like 19th century conceptions of human cognition. And while currently in neuroscience and in cognitive psychology, there are fascinating discoveries which change our ideas about human cognition, and those notions must be brought into sociology and social sciences and probably change them. And currently discussions are about to which extent those changes must happen. And one pole is that some cultural sociologists say we simply don't need this notion. It's not sociology. And the other pole is actually sociology should be converted into cognitive social sciences, cognitive social science. For example, one of leading theorists, Marl Lizardo, proposed that several years ago. And so on the one hand, this cognitive turn brings it's kind of threatens cultural theory with the danger of reductionism, cognitive reductionism. But on the other hand, in this particular case, when we speak about inequality, it proved to be quite beneficial for culture, because economists and sociologists realized that the model of Homo economicus doesn't really work, because human cognition works differently, and to describe economic behavior and to describe the processes which have to do with inequality, we need to consider these cognitive processes. And when they started to consider those cognitive processes, culture came in, because it's appeared that those cognitive processes are deeply intertwined with cultural stereotypes and other cultural patterns. So culture are returning to the studies of inequality. And one of the most important figure who must be mentioned in this respect is Michelle Lamont. Her and her colleagues did a lot to return culture back, and this is, I think, growing frontier of in sociology. And so, and then after figuring out these two major events, I'd like to land in to some more particular substantive issues. I'd like to start from what could seem a paradox, that when we talk about inequality, we first of all talk about economic numbers. So Gini index, rich to poor ratio, things like that. So inequality is basically about that. But as soon as we ask ourselves why it is even important, why those numbers are so important, that inequality is so big, so huge social problem, then we necessarily face explanation which bring culture and bring important emotional dimension. Because first of all, the first obvious answer which pops up immediately is inequality matters because of because of its connection to justice. And for example, Joran Turnborn wrote that actually the problem of justice is even constitutive for the problem of inequality, because if some social difference doesn't have to do with justice, then it's simply not inequality, it's just difference. And but of course, and if we describe these things in, let's say, Durkheimian terms, we will the emotional dimension will be not just important for description of the problem, but also it will be definitive, because we will have to describe justice as the sacred category of social life, which, as many other sacred categories in our time, become the most visible when they got violated. And we see the issues of justice got most visible when the opposite is happening, meaning injustice. And even singular injustice, as we see, can actually raise very powerful emotional response. And one single injustice can bring thousands of people to the street, thousands of angry people to the streets, as we see. And so this is one obvious connection of an obvious kind of foundation, emotional foundation of inequality. But there is one less obvious thing, but I think no less important, probably even more important than justice. And this is what could be called dramatic or even existential effects of inequality, because inequality gets deep into human nature and distorts it. And here, when I say so, I obviously move along the lines of Marxian thoughts, because it's very close to the substance of the idea of alienation of work, which is only important because it is an alienation of human being from their own nature. And we can see, empirically, we can see it can be manifested very easily at a social level by problems of marginalization of large social groups, by lack of social cohesion and other dramatic effects. And on the individual level, inequality produces despair and humiliation. And because of that, this brought Michel Lamont to state that there is actually, at the very basic level, there's two equally important dimensions of inequality. One is, of course, distribution. First of all, economic distribution, but another, dimension is social recognition, and it has to do with identity. So inequality actually strongly affect people's identity, and they affect the recognition people got and social groups got, and respect. And these are actually some basic facts of our lives, because some social groups and individuals got a lot of respect and recognition, while other social groups and individuals got humiliation. And those are some basic conditions of their lives, and which reproduce themselves on very different layers of social life. So this is a very important condition of contemporary life, and it works by means of evaluations of the problem. The process, the social process of evaluations comes to the fore. So we nowadays evaluate more and more, and got evaluated all the time. So, and this evaluation we do, it's not just our choice, it is evaluation which brought by the design of social life, of contemporary social life. And if we follow the theorizing of for example, Richard Sennett, who did a lot of research on dignity and respect under the condition of inequality, he actually started from the idea of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said that the basis of the inequality is envy. So, but this envy, it's not just a psychological feature of some particular people, but it's rather systemic social thing, systemic social fact. And this is very close to the ideas of Max Scheler about sociology of resentment, because this resentment in the modernity, this resentment becomes systemic. So we like neurotically evaluate and got evaluated all the time, and this brings a lot of fear, anxiety, and humiliation, and this comes a lot of misery in people's lives, and that's why this is so important. But this is the thing about recognition is, this is what could be called this momentarily snapshot of inequality, of the picture of inequality. But the students of inequality often describe this dynamic dimension of inequality, which has to do with reproduction of inequality. And this is another very important issue. And here again, we will see that emotional dimension is very important for understanding what is happening. So we know that that inequality has a tendency to reproduce in all the existing societies. So it works like that. And of course, there are some institutional mechanism of that. So simply speaking, under some institutional settings, advantaged people can legally buy the opportunities for their kids. But even if we put this in brackets, and even if we address to the most meritocratic out of the existing systems, we'll see that following, using the words of Paul of Paul Willis, working class kids get working class jobs, and and this is mostly happening through education and career, and mostly through education. And in the sociology of education, there is since the times of Raymond Boudon, there is this well known primary and secondary effects of inequality in education, which basically mean that the kids from the advantaged families statistically learn better, and they study better academically, and they are better in decision making. So they have better, higher ambitions, and they build their educational path and their career in a more successful way. That's how inequality reproduced, and both of these mechanisms are very cultural in their nature. But we know that if we try to use this explanation, which would be close to explanation from the culture of poverty theories, it would be not only ethically but also empirically wrong, because some studies show that it's not about wrong and right values. The same values can work very differently under different institutional and economic contexts. So the first thing which Michelle Lamont and her colleagues bring to the discussion is that it is very important to study how these particular cultural patterns fit in these particular institutional economic settings. But then there is another important thing which brought by cognitive turn, because at the micro level, it is those motivation to study, which we see more in the advantaged groups and less in disadvantaged group, and these ambitions which help them, which help the advantage to do a more to make a more sophisticated decision about the education and her career. They all have to do with these emotional drivers of action, which can be very differently allocated. And then we have to, when we look at this side, we realize that what we have to do is to see how particular cultural patterns got combined with particular cognitive processes, or to use this notion of Michael Polanyi, how culture harness cognitive processes, and how this cultural cognitive combination fit into this economical and institutional context. And then we see the picture. So it's not about right and wrong values. It's not about the amount of cultural capital, though amount of cultural capital of course matters, and values matter to some extent. But what really matters is how they fit. And the best metaphor I was able to come up with till that moment is, for this process, is the metaphor of sportsman on a field. And a good athlete, what helps him to be efficient? This not only this muscular strength and things like that. This is rather neuromuscular junctions. So if we take good athlete, let's say football player, and equally strong and fast layman, not a sportsman, a sportsman will be much more efficient, not because he is stronger or she is stronger, and not because they are faster, but because their neuromuscular junctions perfectly fit in this particular game. So if we return back to our issues, I think many of such examples could be found in Jennifer Silva's fascinating book Coming Up Short, because there are a lot of description of a particular situation where we see that it's not that working class kids are not reflexive. It's not that they lack the emotional intellect. It's not that they don't try hard enough. It's just their cultural cognitive combinations not fit in well to this current institutional economic context. And I think this is very important, and this is where the whole debate should move. And probably here, and yeah, maybe to wrap it up, I think it's not only very important for culture and for inequality, but I think the very important thing about these cultural sociological invasion to the inequality studies is that it actually opens up the field for and tends to make it really interdisciplinary, because we need collaboration with cognitive scientists, we need collaboration with economists, we need collaboration with historians of institutions. It all has to be brought in, so that we saw this picture as in full. Yeah, and here I'd like to stop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So Jennifer, please.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a discussant for this panel on the cultural dimensions of inequality. I thought the abstract was beautifully written and also very thought-provoking, really nicely bringing together research from different fields and putting them together to think about this under-theorized but ever-present role of emotions in reproducing and then possibly challenging social division. And so what I want to do today is think about some of the passages in the paper that really resonated with me and try to build off some of the key insights. And it's also to think about methods, which is especially thinking about how interviewing and life histories may be a way to tap into the emotional contours that we're talking about. And I think that these emotional foundations are critical, as the abstract argues, the paper says, for understanding the seemingly natural reproduction of social inequality. One of my favorite lines in the paper said that while quantitative sociology tells us much about the chances of this or that social group and the mechanisms which contribute to those life chances, we don't really see how they're connected without major dramatic consequences of inequality, such as marginalization of large social groups, growing polarization, and loss of cohesion. And in order to try to conceptualize this relationship, the paper says, we need to figure out how to access meaning in people's lives, motivation, identity, dignity, and mutual recognition. And I will say personally, I really enjoyed this paper because I'm someone who usually starts from like data and works their way up, and you actually helped me to see what I do in a new way. And so that was really helpful. And so I've been trying to think about, what does this turn towards emotions to study inequality look like? And I think we have to take as a starting point that people's experience of the world, whether or not we think their emotions or perceptions are valid or whether or not we think they make sense, is to think about how these emotions have a real impact on how people act, on their health, on their relationships, because people experience their emotions as natural and true and ready-made. And so in my own work, I use qualitative work interviewing to understand how people make sense of inequality and how they also envision solutions to inequality. And I think that through these interviewing methods, and I work in the School of All Economists, so I'm always like the strange one, but I think these qualitative methods like interviewing helps us understand the mechanisms that underlie large demographic patterns that we see through quantitative data. And sometimes when we talk to people about their emotions and perceptions, we understand the mechanisms that connect culture and action in ways that could never be assumed in advance. And so I actually wanted to talk a little bit about some work I've been doing on how poor and working class Americans understand politics, really relevant this week here. And so the puzzle of inequality that we have in the US is that for decades, good jobs for working class people have been shipped overseas or automated or eliminated. Basically, for the last 30 years, politicians who are Democrats and Republicans have cut the social safety net, weakened workers' power, prioritized corporate profits over workers' needs. But one of the things that we see is that instead of fighting back, most poor and working class people in the US basically are the least motivated to act in their own self-interest. So the people in the US who don't vote tend to be poor, less educated, and they also tend to be more racially diverse. And we see people with low levels of income and education don't really join civic or political groups. They don't get involved with campaigns. And then when they do act, it usually is actually against each other. So for example, right now we have white working class people turning against racial minorities, immigrants, and poor people. And this kind of taps into this idea Dmitry said about the culture of poverty, because usually it's sort of like we say, oh, those dumb working class people, they have bad values, they're not smart enough to act in their own best interests. And so what we're trying to do, I think, is instead of blaming culture, is to try to figure out how they understand their interests and not just impose what we think should be their interests, but instead get into that emotional substance of their worldviews try to figure out the stories they tell that help them arrive at these views, and try to understand, like, what are these emotions that make politics resonate with their own lives or not. And so I think what I'm trying to do is, if we look at the stories people tell about who they are and about what they've been through, you know, quantitative research can tell us how people think and where their attitudes fall on an attitude scale, but it doesn't really let us see how they arrive at those positions. And it's here, I think, that we can really think about narrative and the way that when people tell stories, they're always deeply moral. So when they tell stories about themselves, they're selecting some things that happened to them as very formative, and then they're not thinking about other things. And if we take the stories that people tell about the world, we often can understand why they might make choices that go against their self-interest. So there was a ethnography of Tea Party voters by Arlie Hochschild, and she found that people knew that they were sacrificing clean air and water and health, but they did it in the name of capitalism because they thought that taking risks would bring them honor and it would make them feel free. And so we're sort of challenging conventional notions of voters who are making choices based on strictly their rational interests. And there was actually another study recently by two political scientists, Aiken and Bartels, and they argue that most voters choose who they vote for based on how someone like me should feel. So they actually approach politics much more through emotion and identity than through actual any policy details. And so it's like, if we want to understand why people seemingly act against their own interests, we first have to see how they imagine the self and how this self relates to their larger world. And this, I think, is a process that's imbued with emotion. And so in my own work, I just finished this study actually of spending several years in this small rural town and talking to people about their political views and who they wanted to vote for and what they thought about opportunity and inequality. And so I wanted to actually just throw out two examples of people I talked to think about how we might see emotion being implicated in the reproduction of inequality. So when I went and talked to people, working class and poor people, I actually found that many of them were very critical of economic inequality, and they were very critical of politicians who had failed to protect them from poverty and shame and exploitation. But all of the places that used to mediate between their personal pain and collective struggle were gone. So they didn't really have jobs or unions or lasting marriages, churches or social clubs. They didn't even believe in political parties anymore. And instead they felt very betrayed by social institutions. And so as we talked to them, they would tell me about their strategies for making suffering bearable. And so they talked a lot about triumphing over pain, and they drew these very strong moral boundaries between who was deserving and who wasn't. But the way they did it was that they did it in a very solitary way, and a very deeply emotional way as well. So I want to give the example of Roger, who is a white working class man I met. He's 42 years old, and the way I see it is he's expressing pain as a loss of social recognition. He has a loss of purpose in his life. And for him, holding on to a sense of, he does believe that workers deserve rights, but he wants to exclude women and racial minorities from this group. And so when I meet him, actually, he's tells me he's been trying to get medical assistance from the government because he says he has depression, diabetes, heart failure, and many other problems, but they haven't been able to get any help. And he's actually been out of work since 2009. And when I meet him, he's actually just lying on his sofa, and he has like pill bottles next to him. And he basically is living, there's a doctor in town who will prescribe opiate painkillers for him. Like, if he calls the doctor with a problem, the doctor looks at him for 5 minutes and then just writes a prescription for very strong drugs. And so they're basically only getting by with a little bit of help from the government for food for their children. And what was really interesting by him is that, so he doesn't say, oh, he's not a Republican, he's actually a registered Democrat, and he doesn't believe that we should be free of government intervention, and he's actually very proud that his dad had pensions from the government, and he voted for Barack Obama. But he says, my dad was a Democrat, I'll stay Democrat for him, but I'll never vote Democrat again. At one time, the Democrats helped our family, but now they don't do enough to create jobs. I think they should have gotten me back to work. He said, I actually wrote Donald Trump a letter. If you help me get my health back, I'll go back to work. And then he starts crying, and he tells me the American dream is only alive for some people, like immigrants and refugees. And he gets really angry, and he says that some people no longer will say the Pledge of Allegiance. And then he says to me that a race war is coming, and it will be black against white, Hispanic against white, and we'll fight it out streets. He says, I very rarely trust anyone, because every time I trust someone, something happens. You don't trust anyone. And so he basically says at the end of our conversation, he asks if I ever play video games. And he tells me, if you look at these video games like Stalker or Fallen Earth, I don't know these at all, but he says, if you see it in these video games, you see how it looks like a wasteland. That's how America's going to look real soon. It's going to be a civil war. And so he's sort of imagining these scenes of violent annihilation and kind of hoping Donald Trump might help him from letting his body become a wasteland. To give one other example, so this is another example of how emotions contribute to how people imagine the self, was a woman I met, a white woman named Shelley Moore. She was 33, and she was the daughter and granddaughter of coal miners. And she had a very, very difficult childhood. So in the interview, I wanted to talk to her about politics, and she wanted to tell me about her childhood and pain. And so she had a very abusive stepfather. And as soon as she turned 18, she moved away from home, and she cut off all connection to her family. And so, again, I keep asking about politics, and they wanted to talk about their families. And so she tells me that what she did was she cut off contact, and then her mother died, and she never got to say goodbye. And Shelley says, that's when I actually spiraled. She spiraled into a heroin addiction. And she said, basically, she ripped her whole life apart because she couldn't cope with the pain. And so she says, when her daughter saw her high on heroin, she actually, detoxed herself. Her husband divorced her. And now she's, living by herself. So I was like, tell me about your life. Like, how do you go on? How do you continue? And so she told me this fascinating story. She says, there's a doctor on YouTube, and there's a segment called How Do Lobsters Grow? And the segment says that when lobsters are soft, mushy creatures, and they live inside a tough, rigid shell. And when the lobster starts to grow, the shell doesn't expand, and the lobster starts to feel very uncomfortable and starts to feel stress. And so the lobster sheds the shell, grows, produces a new shell, and goes off into the world. If lobsters had doctors like us, they would never grow, because if the lobster felt uncomfortable, the lobster would go to the doctor, they would get medication, and the lobster would never experience growth. So how is that different for people? Why would we take people out of stressful situations? Stress is a positive thing because that's how we grow. And she says, basically, for her, avoiding pain and suffering only makes you vulnerable and unprepared for life's trauma. She says, why would you ever blame society for your pain? You need to be stressed out. I didn't even take medicine to get off heroin. I sweated it out and I suffered it out. The best system for growth in life is stress. And so when I was doing this project, so many people I met talked about how suffering was actually really good for them because it was the only way that they could have growth in the self. And then they actually connected that to politics because they believed that the world could not be trusted. So Shelley says, my family was a Democrat. They all live off the state. They have a lot of welfare, but she thinks that's actually what has hurt her family. And so for her, being resilient and having this emotion of pride basically means, she says, I don't need any help. I don't want social safety nets. It's safer for me not to engage at all in politics. And she basically says, like, she's worried about survival and politics doesn't matter at all. She says, you know, I'm not going to put my life or my child's life in the hands of somebody else because I've been betrayed too many times. And so over and over, like, instead of external strategies towards social change, people embraced self-help mantras and conspiracy, and they really like to invalidate the suffering of other people, whether it was racial minorities or people who needed help from the government. And that's how they felt like moral people. They almost saw pain and suffering that comes out of inequality as a test of individual willpower. And then they like to create this whole identity as someone who had survived it on their own. And this doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think here it happens in a place where our social safety nets are very weak, trust is very low, families are very fragile, and opportunity, especially where I did this work, is very scarce for escaping. And so just to sort of bring this back up and reconnect with Dmitry's paper, I think the study of emotions should be attached to narratives. These narratives are widely accessible. So in my work, stories about triumph are widely accessible, but they can be interpreted and used differently among different groups as people can rework these cultural messages to help them make sense of their own lives. And, you know, basically we see people take memories of the past to try to think about where their future is going in a way that I think helps people transcend reality, but also be proud of what they've accomplished. And it has real, so for Shelley, right, she basically now doesn't vote and doesn't have any efficacy in ways that I think could have real consequences for her and for American democracy, but for her, it makes her feel like it's empowering. And so to quote from Dmitry again, in the paper, he says, we thus come to see collectively produced emotions as one of the key foundations of inequality. Inequality is effectual because it is anything but emotionally neutral. Instead of being a mere artifact of economists' calculations, it is a vivid fact of any person's life. And I thank you for this because it sort of helped me see things in my own work that I hadn't seen before. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and especially for bringing into discussion questions of methodology and for bringing into discussion the empirical cases to kind of ground, I think, Dmitry's idea also. Thank you. And now we proceed to the discussants. Olga, please.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much for your fascinating speeches. And your interest really resonates with mine. And I'm engaged in sociology of emotions several years ago. And I really think that through sociology of emotions, we can get more explanation, much more explanations of social inequality. And I like to stress some points in this approach. I really think that emotions are vehicles to deeper understanding of our social order and the social inequality. And this respect, I'd like to outline the main notion how we can to tackle with the problem of inequality. And I think that we should research some different and concrete emotions as the social cultural configurations with their historical features. For example, I'm involved in the research of shame as the main emotion in poverty. in poverty, for example. And other emotions are so important too. For example, as Dmitry wrote in his a fascinating and big article about dignity, respect, and envy, and I should add, for example, gratitude. For example, it's from Zimmer sociology, and when we research such concrete emotion, we see not only the mechanisms of support or undermining of social structure and inequality, but the cultural and social context of inequality, for example. And I think our direction in sociology of emotion to provide some research about the emotions, and so we think the special features of every culture, every society, and we can compare this life experience of inequality. I can, for example, outline the sphere of emotional labor, for example, and you see that not everyone do the same amount of emotional labor in the workplace, for example. And this is very, I think, efficient and productive sphere of sociological interest. And for example, in the shame research, we can see this psychosocial dynamic of the reproduction of social inequality. And I should say, in the relation of the previous speakers, that we have the emotional landscape of despair, because all the emotions of, for example, shame, envy, are saying to us that we have so narrow space for the, for example, resistance. And because shame is emotion which conditions, for example, passivity and some sort of acceptance, the conditions of the poverty, for example. And shame is not a mechanism of resistance, and shame is provoke some despair or stress or some other emotions which is the way to the culture of self-help, for example, as Jennifer says, and to some hiding strategies of behavior, because the people in poverty cannot express themselves, and they have low dignity, and it is really the main problem. I and my colleague research sometimes their experience of rural inhabitants in contemporary Russia, and we found out and discovered their negative emotions of envy and shame, which indicated to their whole social opinion of this, for example, rural labor or rural habitant, all social conditions are saying us about the contempt to physical labor and the rural labor, for example. And these peasants didn't want to resist this condition. conditions, because they have the low self-esteem, and they were very shameful because of their position, and before their whole society, and even before their children. And I think in modern world, in our human rights paradigm are implicated strong emotions. It is a pride, dignity, and some others, and also strong negative emotions such as resentment, and maybe vengefulness, and some others. And the main question in these relations, I think, are these emotions the basis for resistance or for the compliance or agreement with this social world? And I guess that in modern world we have for example, self-help culture and the strategy, individual strategy to tackle these negative emotions, not for social change. And some emotional experience of modern people, I think, maybe go the people out of real social problem. They may be involved in memorial practices or some other practice, and for example, of development of their capacities, but not to change their real social conditions. It's very interesting now how the modern culture direct people to agree to this maybe to this injustice, and even the politics of humiliation, as you know, for example, in political arenas, does not lead to maybe some social changes in this respect. And many sociologists now stress the importance of the dignity politics, and some activities which can grow the feelings of pride and dignity to maybe to live in this inequality climate of modern world. I think this is the main problems, and there are many approaches now in sociology of emotions, which in maybe different sides consider these main questions. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Elena.
Yes, dear colleagues, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be part of this great discussion. I'm very grateful to Dmitry for his very interesting and thought-provoking paper. Actually, a couple of words about my experience. I'm acquainted with problematic of emotions and problematic of respect more from empirical side. A couple of years ago, I started a research about respect of the elderly people in the Russian society. And I made narratives with people over 75, and I'm still doing this, so this project is still in process. So actually, I like a lot your suggestion to pay attention on this cultural dimension of inequality and to consider this problem from the side of emotions and emotionality. I like a lot, and I just formulated several questions and several thoughts which were provoked by your paper. So first of all, I missed some definitions actually. So you write a lot about culture, and for me personally, so I'm not a specialist in sociology, in sociology of culture or cultural studies. So I had this question through all your text. What do you mean? So what means culture? How you comprehend culture? Do you comprehend it as Michel Lamon, or as Michel Bourdieu, or maybe something else? And it is important because this is one of the main prisons in the text. So I like a lot your thesis about culture as a powerful mediator. Culture as a powerful mediator, and it seems me very strong and very promising thing. And so that is why actually I like a lot the junction which you make about emotions and culture, because it seems to me that it allows to include emotions to many different fields through culture. Also, I have some doubts. I have actually some doubts about this junction which you make about emotions and psychology, or emotions and cognition. It seems to me a bit dangerous because in this way you stress this meaning of how to say this personal feelings and the personal world of senses as a foundation of emotionality. Yes, it seems to me that at least we have to consider to perceive this point critically, because when we are talking about emotions, we have to remember that emotions are different. And if, for example, we think about shame or being angry or something else, so it may be really deeply personal. But if we consider such emotions as dignity, respect, and recognition, from my point of view, and actually not only from my point of view, these emotions are so far captured by the political discourse. And actually, Michel Lamon shows this also in her book, Getting Respect. Yes, when people in their narratives reproduce this political discourse, when they are talking about respect or disrespect. That is why it was another problem with definition, how you understand, how you comprehend emotions, and so this is, I would say, the second key term in your paper. Another point, why else this consideration of emotions from the side of psychology and cognition is a bit dangerous, because so I had an imagination that you're trying to produce and present emotions as something genuine, something which cannot lie. Yes, and if we investigate people's emotions, it means that we know the truth about the inequality. And I'm not sure in that. So, because I really believe that emotions have many different levels, and they are very complicated. Just one illustration from my personal research. So I'm making these interviews with elderly people, and actually I had a great problem with development of instrument, development of questionnaire for this interview. So we even had a class in the European University, and I discussed with the students, so how I make question about that. So in the beginning, we decided to ask directly, so when and how you feel respect, and when and how you feel disrespect. It didn't work actually. Elderly people, they were not ready to discuss these issues in these terms. And very fast, they translated my questions to their own language. So usually they prefer to discuss, so to say, good relation, bad relation. So when they feel comfortable, when they feel uncomfortable. So something like this. Again, this emotions is a strongly managed sphere, I would say, on all the levels, on the level of political debate, and also on the level of personality. So that is, so I think these things also have to be taken into account. And what else? I think that also this topic and this approach has good chances to explain something about the society on macro level. Yes, so for example, when we can say that the society has a fair mechanism of social justice, for example, yes. What is fair? What is a mechanism of recognition? What if we see in our research that society has no fair mechanism of recognition? Yes, what it tells us about the society. What if we try to find, but we cannot find some common foundations in this thing? So this question came to my mind because so doing my research, I discussed it with everyone, and once I asked a question to another group of students. So I asked them, what do you think, which group is really undoubtedly respected in the contemporary Russian society? And after a couple minutes of silence, one guy said, maybe veterans, and another guy said, no, definitely not. And so after a brief discussion, they said, professor or high school professor. So that was this resolution of our debate. So it is not clear. Yes, it is not clear. Students could not find so clear and simple answer to this question. What it tells about our society. Yes. Just my last question for my own curiosity. The social credit system in China, is this about emotionality or not? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I actually am a bit surprised that the third question didn't come up about definitions, which is the definition of inequality, because it's also kind of remains a bit vague, even in the big article, I think. So now we proceed to the last discussant. Leonid, please.
Let me first of all to express my gratitude to the organizers and especially to Irina Savelyeva for invitation to take part in this highly intellectual discussion. I was impressed by the presentation by Dmitry Kurakin, who gave an impressive picture of this area. Today, in the context of Poletayev Readings, I would like to start with a memory of 30 years ago, when the first volume in the series Origins, Istoki, was published in 1989, in which Andrey's article on new economic history was published. He was one of the initiators of this prominent series in the area of economic history. And here I think I represent some other view on this problem from the side of economic history and some scientific approaches. In this article, Andrey noted the growing role of research on inequality in the distribution of income and the correlation of inequality with economic growth in the United States and England since the 17th century. In the next 30 years, economic historians have published hundreds of papers on the evolution of income and property inequality across countries and on a global scale. The most famous of them is the book recently published by IGITI, Capital in the 21st Century, which was translated into 15 languages, including Russian. This book, the author uses many sources that characterize this process over 2 centuries. The main conclusion is that inequality is growing both within countries and between countries globally. The last World Congress of Economic History, which occurred in Boston in 2018, the topic of inequality was the leading one. It was discussed both at the plenary session of the Congress and in a number of some particular sections. In economic history, approaches to inequality studies are expanding today to include increasingly socio-cultural contexts of income inequality. However, the basis for considering the socio-cultural aspects of economic inequality is, in my opinion, measuring the degree of this inequality. If we do not have such estimations, then it is not easy for us to assess the compare the emotional perception of inequality, such aspects of it as recognition and dignity outside the context of estimations and of real inequality. What I would like to emphasize, if we don't know more or less exactly what is the level of inequality, I mean, first of all, economic and social inequality, it gives no background for understanding what is happening. And I would like to come to some point of Dmitry Kurakin, who quoted Michel Lamon, who says that instead of looking for right and wrong values, sociologists should focus on how particular strategies of action and other cultural patterns and narrative work under particular economic conditions and institutional settings, which is, I think, very important. After that, she says that they illustrate their thesis by using a variety of empirical evidence which show the importance of context when it comes to how culture affects inequality. Those studies show that the same values might work very differently under different circumstances. It gives us understanding of economic and more widely social conditions, which of course influence on emotions. I agree that, as she says, there are 2 basic dimensions of inequality: distribution and recognition. However, the next sentence in her paper is, They are of equal importance, and in addition, they complement each other. This thesis is under the question, I think. It's not related to the Marxist approach based on the dominance of the material factors. It's a question if we have primary and secondary factors of just, are they equal, or they are to some extent primary and secondary. Let me give a quotation from the recent book by Branko Milanovic, who is the leading specialist in economic inequality today. He works in the United States. The book is named as Inequality, a New Approach for the Era of Globalization. He says that in Russia, the concentration of asset ownership is so high that in terms of inequality, the country is one of the 3 or maybe 5 most unequal countries in the world. It is very likely that concentration of wealth in modern Russia is higher than a century ago, before the outbreak of the First World War. I would like to add that we have some measurements of economic inequality in pre-revolutionary Russia, and it's absolutely clear that the level of inequality was lower in that times in comparison with what we have today. According to the international estimates, the decile coefficient of income inequality in Russia is about 15. It's like in China, and in most of European countries, it is like 10. Russia today ranks first in the world in terms of the number of dollar billionaires in relation to GNP. It is number 1, leader in the world. The question is, what is the emotional perception of this phenomenon in Russia in this economic context today? What about recognition and dignity? Are these values so important for people here? We know the nowadays Russian proverb, if you are so clever, why are you so poor? It is some reflection to the basic emotions about dignity and equality. The same level of inequality and lack of recognition and dignity can result in different social reactions, including radical ones. And I think that today we should include equity as one of the values, emotional values, because we have definitely a lack of equity or fairness here. So my proposal is that the promising area of future research in this area should be connected to some extent to these emotional values like equity, fairness, and all these notions which are so important today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leonid. And now we proceed to general discussion. And meanwhile, maybe Dmitry or someone else wants to reflect on selected points made before.
Well, I'd probably, I mean, if I will answer accurately, I will occupy all the time. So yeah, about definitions, it is a very uncomfortable question, not only for me, but for cultural sociologists as well. And one of the things within this happening cognitive turn is that those cognitive-oriented sociologists always complain that you talk a lot about culture, but you never actually define it. So what about definitions? And there is a whole story without this definition. And my personal take on is that in our social sciences, in opposite to physics, it's hard to give the short definitions. Instead, we give definitions by referring to books and articles and texts and traditions, and answering this taking this scenario in answering these questions, I would say that my vision of culture is based on Durkheimian approach, meaning that what Durkheim himself, Durkheim, as we know, rarely used the word culture, but he used instead collective representations. And the collective representations is pretty close to what many of contemporary cultural sociologists call culture. And just to add some additional details to that, I would say that I'm like theoretically, I'm a part of this. Like my identity is the closest to the strong program in cultural sociology, to Jeffrey Alexander's school, who actually adds to Durkheimian definition this idea of relative autonomy of culture, meaning that culture is never just a transmission between, let's say, structural and economic forces and like, I don't know, psychological and actual and human action actually. But rather it might in some ways it might be function as a transmission, but generally it has its own autonomy. It's a power in itself, and because of that it has its own structure. And so the next important thing about culture is nowadays there is a big debate if a culture is structured or is totally fragmented. And in this question, I'm on the structured side. So I think that it is structured by binaries and metaphors and narratives, but it, of course, all the time it is based on social interaction. So it gets restructured again and again in social interactions. So it's not super solid once and forever. Those binaries, they influence social interactions, but they are influenced by social interactions as well. So this more or less, I'm not sure that's quite satisfactory, but it's the best I can do within a couple of minutes. Emotions, personal or social. I mean, of course, for sociologists, this idea, and especially for Durkheimian tradition, this idea of collective emotions is very important, and because of that, for me, of course, like experiencing emotions has to do with cognitive and psychological processes, but it is structured and by cultural patterns, by narratives, by stories, by metaphors, by cultural binaries. So for me, social part is more important, but when we study particular emotions, it's also important to see how it works on the cognitive level, because the laws of human cognition, psychological laws, so to say, they actually affect, of course, how this or that can happen. So I think this important both, but as I described, actually I described my position in length about that in my recent paper published in the American Journal of Cultural Sociology about cognitive debate, so the closest position for me is this idea of emergentism, where cognitive processes is this substrate for production of emotions, but culture is this next sui generis level. Can emotion lie? I mean, it's a big theme. I mean, short answer would be, of course, they can, but I would also say that they also can establish social facts, which is kind of truth in itself. So they kind of can change the truth or establish truth, social truth, because truth is a social fact, at least for sociologists. So if emotions, of course, can contribute in, for example, simple example from like sociologists, especially cultural sociologists, are obsessed with anthropology and anthropological examples. For example, we know that in some societies, which previously used to be called primitive societies, twins, the birth of twins is supposed to experience as a terrible event. So because two physically identical people actually powerfully challenge the whole idea of the whole symbolic universe. So what they do sometimes, there's a special ritual which actually kind of change this truth. So this, and we know that a ritual is effectual because it includes important and very powerful emotional dimension, and by means of these super intense emotions ritually assembled, this physical truth is actually changed, and it produces social truth that those two are not identical, and they are not supposed to be identical anymore. So yeah, I probably should stop here. The only thing I think I need to address to Leonid's remark about the if distribution and recognition are actually equally important. Actually, it's hard to say equally in such debates. I mean, how one could measure what is more important and what is less important. So I admit I used the word equally in an inaccurate way. But I think what you mentioned next is very important, and it partly could answer this question, because there are some works, and the closest thing I can remember is this work by Gimpelson and Treisman about a difference between actual, factual inequality and perceived inequality. And there are theories which show that the higher level of inequality in society, the lower is legitimacy of political institutes. And they actually studied that, and they saw first that actually the difference between factual and perceived inequality could be very large. So people in different national contexts perceive inequality and the level of equality very differently. And secondly, of course, what is efficient, what is important for political legitimacy of political institutions is perceived inequality and not factual inequality. So, and it has to do with recognition. So probably for something, things of like distribution is more important, and for other things, recognition is more important. But it's hard to say what is more important between them. Yeah, I think I should stop here to give opportunity to talk somebody else.
Okay, I want to first address the comment that we have in the chat from Isaac Davidovich. So it is not clear what scale of analysis we're talking about here, macro level or individual. And it would be good to hear the link between those two levels of analysis within this particular perspective. And then we will have Tamara's question.
Yeah, I think what I tried to do, at least in my paper, is to connect this level, to put these levels in connection, because I think from the point of view of this new cultural sociology of inequality, what is important is at this, when we go to even when we talk about this micro level and how for particular individuals, or most importantly particular social groups, cultural patterns are get into configuration with cognitive processes. After we consider that, is the most important thing is how they actually connected to macro picture of inequality and macro landscape of institutions. So I guess this is the answer. So it is like micro and meso perspective, which is importantly connected to macro perspective.
Tamara, would you maybe announce your question?
Yeah, thank you very much for this session. It's very interesting and very helpful. And yes, and I think Jennifer actually mentioned the same point before leaving the chat. So I have more like a comment, but it's also a methodological question. It's about epistemological epistemological question on the nature of emotions. Because when you try to engage with cognitive scientists, they usually deal with emotions as some very deliberate, very fundamental and evolutionary shaped reactions. And this famous article, well, this field of cognitive culturalists like Lizardo and Vasey, they are now note that the qualitative research, when we engage with narratives and all these life stories, it's all like post hoc justifications, because people just retell, they rationalize their behavior and so on, and emotional reactions to inequality that is expressed through very small everyday interactions, like some people don't want to talk to you, or you feel like you cannot enter this building or something. They are always spontaneous, but they have a very deep emotional, they are embedded into emotions, and they define the course of action in a very strong way. Well, some people have arguments contrary to this, but nevertheless. So how do you see the way out of this problem? So should we, for example, combine experimental methodologies like Vasey suggests for this dual process model of action, or what? Because if you try to talk with cognitive scientists with life stories, they are I myself encountered this reaction. They are very skeptical sometimes about that. They need some more rigid reactions. So
even like speaking about Lizardo and Vasey, we are talking about probably the most cognitivist oriented people in sociology, and even their evolutionary premises, they actually fit well with this idea of cultural and cognitive combination. For example, in this recent working paper of Marl Lizardo and Seth Albertine, they kind of reinterpret the famous book of Annette Lareau about this how working class and parents and middle class parents, how they deal with their kids, and they kind of put strong this evolutionary cognitive psychology basis under this. Mm-hmm. But still, what they see is that they say that there is this basic cognitive process of seeking, for example, but it can be put in different cultural ensembles. It could reshaped so that it will actually work differently. Kind of the same basic cognitive mechanism will work differently in the future when this kid grow up, depending on these cultural conditions of and basically I would say which cultural cognitive configuration it will take. So even if we go to the most extreme cognitive sociologists, we will see that this can be done, this can be studied, and this could be studied not only experimentally, although experiments always good, and if we let some cognitivism invade in our beautiful cultural sociology, we have to also let some experimental methods come. But I think qualitative studies are not undermined by this, and we can take these ideas from and these not just ideas, but actually firm understanding of this cognitive mechanism and see how they work. And I think what I partly tried to do in this paper is to give some additional interpretation to Jennifer's book, to when she described some particular stories, how they work, adding cognitive dimension to that. So, for example, I suggested that this mechanism of cognitive tunneling is actually has to do with what she described, and actually it helps to understand better. So I must admit I don't have like strict methodological appeal here, and at this point it seems to me that anything goes. So qualitative methods go work, quantitative methods go, experimental methods go. They all could be combined in this, under this theoretical umbrella.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have other comments, maybe from discussants or the public? I have a very brief one. Maybe someone will want to reflect on it. It's unfortunate that Jennifer had to leave, but we have talked about post-colonial theory before, and I was wondering concerning emotions and culture and inequality, how can we get in touch with the local contexts, and how can we decolonize kind of inequality studies, because it is evident to me, at least, that there are almost necessarily some categories that are embedded into inequality studies that are very much related to American contexts, for example. So if we read Arlie Hochschild's work on this book, Strangers in Their Own Land, or I believe Jennifer's work, this idea of American dream or hard work or something else comes up very quickly. And I bet in Russia, for example, we don't have developed narratives at all, maybe, or we have narratives that are very uncomfortable to people to say them aloud, like those they had in Soviet times, for example, that are kind of not working anymore for them. So yeah, that was my reaction. Alexei wanted to comment.
Yeah, well, if I have this opportunity, because I'm a complete stranger to both these fields that you try to merge in your contribution. And first of all, I would like to say that if we're talking about emotions, that my emotions about this session is probably joy and gratitude. So thank you. It was really, really interesting, even for the, as I said, for complete strangers to the field. I wonder whether you would like or not different conceptualization of the emotions. I'm not sure that it is helpful, but it sounds quite familiar to me, and I think that it could be interesting. So when you talked about emotions like shame, gratitude, dignity, etc., you try to define it through the cognitive sciences and so on, but would it be valid if I say that emotion is a kind of sustainable trait of character, the part of the selfhood, which is cultivated and demonstrated in a particular sustainable forms of interactions in a sustainable practices? So, I mean that with this definition, it will probably answer the questions by Isaac Fruman, that as a sustainable trait of character, it is something that works definitely on the personal level, but since it is always connected with the sustainable forms of interactions or sustainable practices, it will always work on the macro level. But in this case, if I understand that, so I propose the conceptualization, and I understand that probably you need more time to think about it. But I mean that for me, if we will make such definition, like again, a sustainable trait of character which is cultivated and demonstrated in a particular sustainable practices, then we can link this discussion to a little bit more general, I believe, discussion in the history and theory of knowledge, which is connected with virtue ethics, with virtue epistemology and non-classical epistemologies. Because when I was listening to both, to all participants of the discussions, I thought that for me as a philosopher, it will be easier to call emotions virtues. I see how what we can, get from such reconceptualization, and I feel that it could be really good for the field, again, because it will be more open to different shifts in more general field of epistemology. And but I'm not sure. What do you think? Would it be possible to call these emotions virtues? Because they sound much more like virtues in classical sense. And here we will have Martin Nussbaum, for example, who came again to the questions of inequality from the field of ancient Greek philosophy. Again, we can start with Aristotle. I like him. And Plato and so on. Emotions like virtues. Is it valid?
Can I add the comment? Thank you for all the speakers. It's very interesting for me. And my comment may be very simple for this. And one question is why do we talk about emotion? We talk about them because we seek for the micro link, because emotions are living experience, and in this experience is the connection between macro and micro levels. And I think in this respect, it is useful to see the real emotional practices when they include their beliefs, the rules, the values about the emotional behavior, for example. It is the term of the Monique Scheer, the historian of emotions, and I think it's very effective in the research of emotion, because we can grasp different aspects of the behavior. And I think about the definition of emotions. It is very interesting that in recent times the emotions are defined like rapid appraisals of the situation, and in these appraisals combined not only the feeling and the thinking, but the beliefs about the values. Definitely, and I think it's a very productive line in the emotion research. And in this respect, I'd like to stress that emotions have intentionality, and I think maybe they are the complete lie, but they have intentionality, and we really can learn about the on which subjects or humans or activity they directed, and which attributions are the consequences of these emotions. And in this respect, we can understand the inequality system, because people know when they feel anger or some other feelings, and they estimate their position, and this position it's not, maybe it's not true, but the feeling of this position give us the subject dimensions of inequality. And in this respect, I'd like once more outline that emotions are affective cognitive complexes, and they are cultural configurations of meaning of the situation and about a situation and about the whole world. And we can seek for the, for example, the main norms that define our emotional experience. I think it's very useful. For example, recently I outlined the emotional imperatives of modern times, and I think these research objects can help us to understand how people define their living experience and their positions in inequality structures and their beliefs about that. For example, emotional imperative as to be happy everywhere. It is very, very dangerous because when we want to fulfill this value, we can see the inequality in our life. And what are the consequences? Maybe some people should find some strategies to be happy. Maybe some people discover that we can't happy in these circumstances and maybe resist to this order. And I think through the emotional practices, namely, we can find some promises, areas to research and understand the social order and the inequality system. Thank you.
We have a raised hand from Elena. Would you ask a question or comment? Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question was actually and is for Olga, for you, Olga, and for Jennifer, who's left, unfortunately. But anyway, the question is for Olga, and that is a little bit maybe provocative, but I'm really interested to just understand and clarify something for myself in this area. Olga, do you think that economic, let's say specifically economic inequality, can be explained through emotions, however we define them, but just as a concept generally, emotions alone? If not, then what role do you think emotions really play in this economic inequality? And maybe how, the next part of the question is, how exactly do you see emotions translate into actions, people's actions? Have you maybe traced how through narratives, people's narratives or practices, observation, how these emotions are actually turned into practice, not practices, people's actions? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that emotions are not the factors of economic inequality. Economic inequality is independent variable, and through emotion we can understand the unknown features or traits of inequality only, because from my position and from the position of the sociology of emotions, emotions are the consequences of the social structural conditions. I think so, and this is the main point of the sociological research of emotions. And we can only see how social structure and especially economic conditions influence our emotional experience. And this is a specific interest of sociology, really. And I really don't think some evolutionary or cognitive mechanisms are responsible for the inequality. It's not just the thing for the sociology. I think the emotions are not the direct motivators of action. Emotions are really phenomenological, whole appraisals of the situation and the whole social order, and they create only the tendencies of actions, and including the collective actions. And this position give us the more nuanced approach to the emotion research, because if we think that emotion and then action is not true, their connections is more complicated, and between the action and emotions there are some people thinking and considerations, and they have strong influence on these connections. And maybe we have strong emotion, for example resentment, but we cannot act because of it, because other situational or structural conditions are not allow us to act, for example. And the resentment may be only one factor of, for example, of protest, for example, and mainly resentment actually usually not lead to resistance or protest, for example. Why so? I don't know really exactly, but maybe because of the shame and envy and some individual comparisons do not allow us to act, for example. And I think we have solution when we combine different factors, for example, social-cultural, situational, and some other triggers, and then we have some definite directions for the actions. And in some situation, we have the flash of the social-cultural conditions, situational factors, and some other triggers, and some maybe belief and cultural actors, and then we have collective action, for example. And maybe we should research historical conditions of these configuration, of these constellations of factors. And I think it is the main problem and difficulty of the sociological research of emotions, and especially in inequality system. And the last thing I should say that I have a strong foundations for the thinking that we have now in Russia, the despair and shame. We have no tendencies to protests and to social changes, because we have isolated, and we have disrespect and the shameful experience, and these practices are deepening in, for example, in social media. And I think we have know the basis for collective actions, for example. Thank you.
Before we turn to Boris's question, maybe the same question which was about how emotions can translate into action can be addressed to Elena Bogdanova as well. Maybe in your empirical research, Elena, there was something that that can be said about how emotions translate into action for elderly people, for example.
I'm trying to find some example or illustration. I never thought about it actually. How emotions and action. Actually, it's complicated to find an example, and I'm thinking why. I think that is why people do not like really speak about their emotions openly. This is so. I think this is a good issue to think about, because as I investigate this question, this problem of respect towards the elderly people, of course, I read some other research about this issue, and the researchers pick out at least two approaches towards respect, towards distribution of respect in the society. And one of them is, how to say, it is respect which is which has to be guaranteed to any person, and this is a model which is presented in the book of Michel Lamon, and so this approach is very close to the idea of human rights. So anyone needs respect, and anyone has to have respect. And another model is how to say, it is more typical for authoritarian societies, when people believe that respect has to be achieved, so it is not taken for granted. And in my interviews, I see that elderly people more agree with the second model. With the second model, when they say, so respect is not about myself. So respect is about, so to say, our president or somebody else, some other powerful person. Or professor or something else. So it is interesting, but yes, I do not see this dimension of respect as so equal value, which is guaranteed to anyone in our society. Maybe that is why it is not connected with, it has no strong connection with action. But thank you for this question. I never thought about it. I will do. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for a question by Boris. Could you maybe read it or ask it?
Yes, of course.
I
would like to thank all today's speakers, and particularly Dmitry, both for his abstract and for his article, which is rich of thoughts and examples. And my question refers to the article. It seems to me that we can pose the question about the different types of emotions in relation to inequality. And on the one hand, we discussed the emotions through which and by which with which people adapted to difficulties and inequalities, and on the other hand, you refer in the text to the emotions in the educational context of the emotions of the pupils who committed to some intellectual occupations, and it gave them an advantages to make the right choice, right life choice. Maybe you can comment on this and on the different types of emotions. Thank you.
Thank you for this. I think my take on is that the difference is not that much in emotions themselves, but rather in their allocation and rather in configuration of cultural and cognitive patterns, including emotions and institutional settings. So I would say that principally from the point of view of culture is connected to cognition by means of emotions. Those two situations, meaning motivation of a student and a person who struggle through or developing their coping strategy, coming through sufferings and difficulties, are not dramatical difference. So difference is in these particular configurations and not in type of emotions, at least as far as I see it. And I would like to add a couple of words to previous kind of discussion or question about this emotions and action. I think that emotions are often very appear to be very powerful vehicle of some social and cultural processes which come into being, some important things, and they can shape new truths. And for example, and speaking of inequality, it could be very important and at the micro level, when, for example, during the revolution, the sacred character of private property, for example, gets destroyed by means of, and there is new social consensus behind that, but it gets actualized through this powerful and destructive, but not necessarily destructive, but these powerful collective emotions, which brings into being and creates what is new fairness, what is new justice. So they kind of rebuilds and reshapes the existing consensus. And emotions has to be there. Without emotions, it couldn't be done. And also, speaking of the dignity of the disadvantaged, it's very important. I think there is a very important thought of Max Scheler in his theory of resentment. He said that resentment is so powerful under the condition of modernity because of this contrast between declared equity in dignity between all the people and rights, of course, human rights and dignity. So in theory, there is this, we all human beings, we all have the same dignity and rights. But in fact, and social life tells us, proves it every day, that in fact there are these dramatic differences, and these two, this declarative equity and factual inequality, makes it very dangerous tension and very, destructive tension, which brings into being resentment and humiliation and things of that sort. But I see that Leonid actually wanted to ask or to tell something.
I have some comment and some question. My comment is that basically I share the position which was expressed by Olga in her vision that emotions are independent factor and inequality is independent factor and emotions are dependent variable. Why? Because let's imagine that we have two societies. One society is ruled by meritocracy, and the level of inequality is low. The education is free of charge, all social guarantees are given, and so on. We know such kind of countries. And let's imagine another society which is corrupted, inequality is high, and the success, professional success, the business career depend on different factors and not so much on his merits and qualities. I think that emotions are quite different in these two examples of society, and the emotion of dignity, recognition, self-respect is not the same in these two societies. So my question is, if the common point in the literature about emotions and inequality is basically oriented to the equal role of inequality and emotions, as it was mentioned in this French paper. I'm not specialist definitely in emotions and inequality, but it's my impression that inequality is primary and emotions is some consequence of this point of inequality. So the question is, what about literature? Is all this literature based on the position of equal role of inequality and emotions, or there are different different points?
I should say that of course emotions have their psychological dynamics, and maybe in some circumstances they are independent. But the main question is who control the emotional standards and the emotional rules. And maybe emotions are the same, but there are no freedom to express them. And in the country with democracy and we have more freedom to express different emotions. And in the literature, in the body of work on sociology of emotions, we have two main points. Emotion can support the social order, and emotion can undermine the social order, and all depend on the circumstances and the events and situational maybe factors and historical condition of it. And I think there are not so many situations where emotions are independent. They are mechanisms that can facilitate our adaptation, and we can resist, and also we can resist on the basis of emotions. But the social order prescribes us their main ways and strategies. And undoubtedly, we have unconscious emotional states. We have moods, long-term moods, for example, and they are maybe the conditions of the events and some relationships, future relationships, and others. And I think now in the sociology of emotions is usually we have usually a research about the concrete circumstances of emotional expression and manifestations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes. Dear colleagues, I have to say with deep sorrow and frustration that we don't have much time for any further discussion. So once again, this proves that combination of emotions and the field of inequality studies is a very intellectually and emotionally rich topic.